Tonight, we will not retell the familiar stories of knights in shining armor or lavish feasts in grand castles. Instead, we will step into the lives of the most ordinary, yet the toughest people of all, the medieval peasants. These were the ones who lived on the margins of history, yet carried the full weight of society on their frostbitten, labor-worn shoulders. They were nameless heroes, without fame, without songs to honor them, only rough hands, frozen toes, leaky roofs, and endless winters. And yet it was they who kept the heartbeat of Europe alive. Imagine for a moment that you are not a noble, sipping sweet wine at an oak table, but a peasant born in a mud hut, growing up with an empty stomach and falling asleep to the whistle of wind through the cracks in the walls. You don't dream of becoming a knight or a priest. You only think about whether tomorrow there will be a turnip to boil, wood to burn, and the hope of waking up without being carried off by a fever. That alone would be a great victory. The life of a peasant was no romantic tale. It was a relentless struggle against nature, against landlords, against taxes, against disease, and sometimes against despair itself. The cold was only one enemy. Hunger was the true tyrant. Every harvest was a gamble. Seeds cast into the soil, with prayers for just enough rain, not too much nor too little. Hopes that rats wouldn't devour the grain, that no plague would kill the livestock. For when the fields failed, the whole village fell into famine. There were no stores to buy food, no markets overflowing with bread. If the earth refused to yield, you had only two choices: starve or eat whatever scraps you could find. Tree, bark, wild weeds, even tiny creatures no one would consider food in better times. Medieval peasants knew well the taste of frozen turnips, thin gruel mixed with grit, black bread as hard as stone. A piece of salted meat at the table was so rare that families spoke of it for weeks. Their lives were filled not with grandeur, but with dirt under their nails, coughing fits in smoky huts, growling stomachs, and children crying from hunger, broken only by the hollow laughter of adults pretending everything would be all right. Yet, in that fragile laughter lay a strange strength. Peasants still sang, still told stories, still joked in the freezing dark, as though laughter could patch the holes in their roofs. But the peasants' struggles weren't only with nature. They had to endure the weight of lords, masters, and tax collectors. After toiling from dawn to dusk, when their trembling hands gathered in the grain, someone would arrive to take most of it away, leaving them just enough or less to scrape by. They watched their children gnaw on turnip peels, knowing that the best of their harvest lay locked in someone else's granary. To resist was unthinkable. The glittering sword of a knight behind the taxman answered every doubt. This injustice wasn't a passing cruelty, but a system that endured for centuries. And yet, instead of collapsing, peasants learned to endure, as though resilience itself was an inheritance passed from father to son, mother to daughter. Their hardship became the very foundation of society. Without peasants sowing seeds, castles would have no bread, courts no feasts. You may think winter was the greatest terror, but imagine summer when plague swept through villages, flies swarming, black swellings rising on the skin, and the laughter of children falling silent one by one. That was true hell. Peasants could not read medical texts. They called it God's punishment, and knelt in prayer even as they kept working the fields. For even if they survived the sickness, to stop working meant certain starvation. This cruel contradiction haunted them, but still they pressed on, clinging to saints' rituals, whispered prayers beside flickering candles on crude wooden altars, all in search of hope that tomorrow might be less cruel than today. And somehow, amid all the misery, they still found space for festivals. After the harvest, after giving the Lord his share and keeping their own scraps, the village would gather. They danced, they drank weak ale, they ate hard bread, they sang loud, short songs. For a moment they forgot that winter was coming, that their feet would crack open in the cold, that their children would soon shiver under straw blankets. Festivals were a kind of opiate, but also the only medicine that kept them going. Year after year, season after season, generation after generation, medieval peasants lived this way. Not in glory, not in chronicles of kings, but in the quiet survival that sustained everything else. Without them, no castle could stand, no kingdom could last. They never asked to be remembered as heroes, but if anyone deserves the title, it is them. For in the face of hunger, cold, injustice, and death, they endured. And by enduring, they wrote one of the most important chapters of human history without a single word of it set down on parchment. When the sun rose through the mist of winter, the peasant once again dragged himself to the fields, hand gripping the old wooden plough, shoulders pulling along a bony ox. The soil was never obedient, sometimes hard as stone, sometimes soft as mud. But the peasant had to plough, for if he did not, there would be nothing to eat in the coming season. You may think this work simple, but imagine walking in coarse wooden shoes, feet soaked with frost, back bent under the burden, hands calloused by shovels and hoes, and all of it only to claim a small share of the grain you sowed. The rest was already destined for the Lord or the church. Duty, obligation, tithe. Beautiful words to mask the bitter truth. You worked more for others than for yourself. And while you ploughed, the cold cut through your rough wool cloak. You bent down to breathe warm air into trembling hands, only to continue again because the earth would not wait for you. It knew only its own seasons, its rains, its winds, and if you fell behind even a single day, the harvest would leave you behind. This was the harsh truth peasants knew better than anyone. Even without books, they could read the soil, read the clouds, read the winds, and by this knowledge they survived. But survival was never gentle. Each season was a battle and enemies were countless. When it was not the cold, it was locusts. When not floods, then drought. When not sickness, then war. For whenever a lord waged war, it was the peasants' fields that were first trampled, their seeds stolen, their cattle driven off. If they survived, they were forced to rebuild from nothing, as though fate delighted in testing their endurance endlessly. They had no choice but to endure, in poverty, in injustice, in the whip cracks of the powerful. And strangely, endurance became their strength. Like a tree sprouting on rocky ground, peasants learned to smile through pain, to sing even with empty stomachs, to teach their children a simple, brutal lesson. Life is never fair, but still you must go on. Because if you do not, you vanish. And in their world, vanishing was the worst fate of all. No one remembered a peasant's name, no chronicle recorded a starving family. History marched forward without looking back. So, to resist being forgotten, they chose to remain, to cling on. They left no trace in parchment, but in the furrows of ploughed earth, in the stones lifted from the fields, in the drops of sweat absorbed into the soil. In that way, they carved their names into the land, the only thing that would never betray them. When night fell upon the medieval village, fear came not only from cold or hunger, but from the darkness itself. For in the dark lurked things peasant never fully understood, wild beasts, bandits, or perhaps the ghosts of imagination. They lit a small tallow candle, its flickering glow casting shadows on mossy walls. Children huddled in straw, ears straining at the howl of wind through the cracks. To push fear away, the elders told stories, tales of wandering spirits in the forest, of witches in the night, of saints who guarded the good. Those stories sowed both fear and hope, and in them peasants found a reason to keep believing. They had no books to read, no philosophy to ponder, only legends and faith. And faith became the invisible cloak shielding them from despair. By day they bent their backs to the earth. By night they bowed before a crude wooden altar, a cross made of 2 sticks, lips murmuring prayers learned from their parents. In those moments they felt less alone. They knew well that dawn would bring labor again, that the tax collector would knock again, that the cold would bite again. But for a night they had the illusion that someone listened, someone watched over them. Hardship sharpened their senses. A crow's cry, a full moon, the smell of smoke in the wind, all became omens, good or ill. And it was this belief that kept their spirits from breaking. You might laugh to hear that a black cat crossing the doorway foretold sickness, but for them such belief mattered more than truth. For truth was too cruel, while belief gave them a reason to survive one more day. And so, night after night, generation after generation, these stories were told and retold, not treasures of gold or silver, but treasures of resilience and innocence, the only wealth that poverty could never steal. When the sun rose through the mist of winter, the peasant once again dragged himself to the fields, hand gripping the old wooden plough, shoulders pulling along a bony ox. The soil was never obedient, sometimes hard as stone, sometimes soft as mud. But the peasant had to plough, for if he did not, there would be nothing to eat in the coming season. You may think this work simple, but imagine walking in coarse wooden shoes, feet soaked with frost, back bent under the burden, hands calloused by shovels and hoes, and all of it only to claim a small share of the grain you sowed. The rest was already destined for the Lord or the church. Duty, obligation, tithe. Beautiful words to mask the bitter truth. You worked more for others than for yourself. And while you ploughed, the cold cut through your rough wool cloak. You bent down to breathe warm air into trembling hands, only to continue again because the earth would not wait for you. It knew only its own seasons, its rains, its winds, and if you fell behind even a single day, the harvest would leave you behind. This was the harsh truth peasants knew better than anyone. Even without books, they could read the soil, read the clouds, read the winds, and by this knowledge they survived. But survival was never gentle. Each season was a battle and enemies were countless. When it was not the cold, it was locusts. When not floods, then drought. When not sickness, then war. For whenever a lord waged war, it was the peasants' fields that were first trampled, their seeds stolen, their cattle driven off. If they survived, they were forced to rebuild from nothing, as though fate delighted in testing their endurance endlessly. They had no choice but to endure, in poverty, in injustice, in the whip cracks of the powerful. And strangely, endurance became their strength. Like a tree sprouting on rocky ground, peasants learned to smile through pain, to sing even with empty stomachs, to teach their children a simple, brutal lesson. Life is never fair, but still you must go on, because if you do not, you vanish. And in their world, vanishing was the worst fate of all. No one remembered a peasant's name, no chronicle recorded a starving family. History marched forward without looking back. So, To resist being forgotten, they chose to remain, to cling on. They left no trace in parchment, but in the furrows of ploughed earth, in the stones lifted from the fields, in the drops of sweat absorbed into the soil. In that way, they carved their names into the land, the only thing that would never betray them. When night fell upon the medieval village, fear came not only from cold or hunger, but from the darkness itself. For in the dark lurked things peasant, never fully understood, wild beasts, bandits, or perhaps the ghosts of imagination. They lit a small tallow candle, its flickering glow casting shadows on mossy walls. Children huddled in straw, ears straining at the howl of wind through the cracks. To push fear away, the elders told stories, tales of wandering spirits in the forest, of witches in the night, of saints who guarded the good. Those stories sowed both fear and hope, and in them peasants found a reason to keep believing. They had no books to read, no philosophy to ponder, only legends and faith. And faith became the invisible cloak, shielding them from despair. By day, they bent their backs to the earth. By night, they bowed before a crude wooden altar, a cross made of 2 sticks, lips murmuring prayers learned from their parents. In those moments, they felt less alone. They knew well that dawn would bring labor again, that the tax collector would knock again, that the cold would bite again. But for a night, they had the illusion that someone listened, someone watched over them. Hardship sharpened their senses. A crow's cry, a full moon, the smell of smoke in the wind, all became omens, good or ill. And it was this belief that kept their spirits from breaking. You might laugh to hear that a black cat crossing the doorway foretold sickness, but for them, such belief mattered more than truth. For truth was too cruel, while belief gave them a reason to survive one more day. And so, night after night, generation after generation, these stories were told and retold, not treasures of gold or silver, but treasures of resilience and innocence, the only wealth that poverty could never steal. Beyond the fields and the huts, the church was the only place that brought peasants both fear and comfort. The cold stone walls, the echoing bells, the sermons in Latin of which they understood almost nothing. Yet still they knelt, still they made the sign of the cross, still they bowed their heads and listened. For they believed that if God was displeased, hunger and cold would be even more terrible. The church taught them that poverty was a test, that patient endurance would be rewarded in the world to come. And the peasants believed, not because they were naive, but because they had no other choice. They needed a reason to endure, and the promise of heaven was the only medicine for the spirit. At the same time, the church was also where they gathered, where they felt they were not completely alone. Every religious festival turned into a new occasion to sing, to dance, sometimes to drink too much, and in those moments they were freed from daily exhaustion. Just to see the flicker of candles, to hear voices lifted in song inside the church, was enough to lighten their hearts, though as soon as they stepped outside, the fields and the taxes awaited them again. They also knew the church was not entirely merciful, for the tithe it collected was no less heavy than the dues of the Lord. Yet still they remained bound to it, because without the church there was no hope, and losing hope was more frightening than losing a harvest. And so the peasants kept going to Mass, kept kneeling, kept believing that though today was misery, tomorrow in heaven they would be filled, and this fragile faith kept them from collapsing beneath the storms of life. Alongside the cruel winters, the peasants' other great enemy was famine. And famine never announced itself. It came after a season of strange rains or a parched summer, or simply because rats had found their way into the granaries. The peasant was used to cutting the meal into scraps, to soaking black bread hard as stone in water to soften it, then dividing it among the family. Sometimes sawdust or bark had to be mixed in to trick the stomach. Children cried out in hunger, and mothers soothed them with hollow promises that tomorrow there would be porridge, though they themselves did not know if there would be anything left to cook. Often, hunger became a constant ghost. People dreamed of food in their sleep, only to wake in disappointment and tears. Some villages were driven to eat dogs and cats, and in the harshest years there were whispers of cannibalism, though few dared admit it. This horrific truth revealed one thing: survival could drive peasants beyond every moral boundary. Yet, astonishingly, they still shared what little they had. A bowl of watery gruel might be carried to a sick neighbor, a scrap of bread given to an orphaned child. They knew that if one person fell, the whole village grew weaker. Famine, then, was not only a struggle against nature, but also a test of community spirit. And in the deepest misery, human kindness shone brighter than any torch. The faint fire in a thatched hut was proof that solidarity could keep people standing even when their bellies were empty and their hearts heavy with dread. War was another, dark cloud that often loomed over the peasant sky. They did not need to go to the battlefield to be victims. They were always the first to suffer. Whenever a lord decided to quarrel with a neighboring land, soldiers marched through the villages, trampling fields, seizing livestock, burning granaries to cut the enemy's supplies. To the peasants, it made no difference who fought. Like weeds crushed underfoot, they had no voice, no choice. All they could do was clutch their children and flee to the forest, waiting for the fire to die down and the smoke to clear before returning to the ashes of what had once been home. Sometimes a village never recovered. Sometimes the survivors scattered to start again from nothing. Thus, war killed not only with swords and spears, but also with hunger, cold, and silent loss. Peasants knew they had no say in these affairs, so they learned to survive in silence, burying seed jars in the ground, hiding dried meat beneath the floor to keep it from looters, rebuilding huts from charred scraps, sowing seeds, even knowing that next year it might all be destroyed again. Such resilience was never praised in chronicles, yet it was what brought wasted lands back to life. And sometimes, in the midst of war's smoke and ruin, peasants felt a strange freedom. When everything was gone and nothing left to lose, they felt lighter, as though freed from their chains. But such moments were brief, for soon a victor would emerge, taxes would be levied again, and the cycle would begin anew. For peasants, war was never heroic battles but a recurring nightmare, and they were the nameless souls trapped inside it. When winter spread its white shroud over the fields, peasants fought not only the cold, but also isolation. Muddy tracks froze, wagons stuck, merchants no longer came, and the village turned into an island in a sea of snow. In that stillness, the barking of dogs and the coughs of children echoed everywhere. Nothing made one feel smaller than standing beneath the night sky, staring up at the stars, realizing one's existence was only dust. Yet even that dust had to keep pulling the plough, keep lighting the fire, keep the family alive. Sometimes isolation drove people to madness. Stories were told of old folk wandering into the snow, never to return, perhaps because they did not want to be a burden, or perhaps because they were tired of fighting winter itself. But most stayed, endured, because they knew that spring would eventually come. And if they survived, they would see new shoots rising from the frozen ground, a small miracle, but enough to make them believe that all suffering was not in vain. While the fields were always at the heart of peasant life, the side crafts were their lifeline during the frozen winter months, when the ground hardened like stone and the plough could no longer bite into the soil. Peasants were not only farmers. With their calloused yet skillful hands, they fashioned small but essential items. The men often took the time to repair chipped plough blades or reforge dull knives in makeshift forges at the edge of the village, while the women sat for hours at rickety wooden looms, weaving thick woolen cloths to keep out the cold or to trade for salt and dried fish from the rare travelling merchants. Even the children were not idle. They twisted ropes from hemp fibres, wove baskets from willow branches gathered by the river, and proudly showed them off as if they were trophies. These crude, simple goods never brought wealth, but they were what kept the village from starving during the long, relentless winter. The monthly market fair was a major event, not just for trade, but also as a reminder that peasants were still connected to the larger world beyond their fields. They carried on their shoulders hastily woven cloths, freshly made wicker baskets still smelling of sap, or scrawny chickens, hoping to exchange them for salt, some iron, or, if fortune allowed, a sharp new blade. Amid the noisy crowds, they listened eagerly to stories told by far-travelled merchants, tales of the great seas, of bustling cities, of castles lit brightly through the night. Though they knew they would never set foot in those places, merely hearing about them was enough to ignite a spark of wonder deep inside. Yet when they returned home, their loads were light, just a bit of salt and a handful of rumours, and they were reminded once more that the outside world was not theirs. And so they went back to the fields, to the loom, to the fire crackling in their dim huts. Still, these humble crafts did more than sustain life. They wove the community together. No family could provide for itself entirely. One household might weave, another forge, another tend bees for honey, another heal with herbs. This mutual dependence became an unwritten law. If you turned your back on a neighbour, tomorrow you would find no one to lend you a plough horse, no one to trade bread for salt, no one to help rebuild your roof after a storm. Peasants knew better than anyone that in poverty, survival came not from the strength of the individual, but from the tangled, unbreakable web of the community, as firm and enduring as the roots of an ancient tree beneath the earth. Perhaps that is why they never truly collapsed. Each basket woven, each cloth spun, each iron blade forged was not merely an object of use, it was a symbol of resilience, of symbiosis, of the way people leaned on one another to keep from vanishing in a world that was often far too harsh. The life cycle of a medieval peasant was like a wheel that never ceased to turn. From birth to death, every stage of existence was already mapped out. A newborn entered the world in a damp hut of clay and straw, with no cradle or fine cloth, only a bundle of straw for a bed and a rough woolen wrap to ward off the cold. Survival through the first fragile months was itself a miracle, for sickness and hunger often struck swiftly, stealing infants before they had learned to call their mother. Those who endured grew up on thin gruel, frozen turnips, and occasionally a little watered-down milk from a lean cow. Childhood, as we might imagine it, scarcely existed. By the age of 6 or 7, a child was already expected to work, barefoot in the fields, plucking weeds, tending the geese, or hauling bundles of firewood from the forest. Their early years were shaped by the smell of soil, the sting of smoke, and the constant gnawing of hunger. Adolescence brought heavier burdens. Boys followed their fathers, learning how to guide the plough, mend broken blades, or build fences. Girls followed their mothers, spinning thread, weaving cloth, cooking whatever meagre food could be scraped together. The first lessons of life were not learned in schools, but in the fields and at the hearth. Now and then, dreams flickered of becoming a knight, of living in a bustling city, but those dreams dissolved quickly under the weight of hunger and toil. Imagination was a luxury peasants could rarely afford. Marriage came not through romance, but arrangement. Parents chose partners to strengthen ties between families or simply to share labor. Weddings were modest, a few loaves of bread, a cask of weak ale, perhaps a roasted chicken, and some rough songs sung by the whole village. Yet these humble celebrations were among the few days of joy in the peasant's year. The next morning, however, the wheel turned again, the groom to the fields, the bride to the fire, and the cycle resumed. Soon they became parents themselves, bringing new children into the same cold huts, worrying over the same hunger, the same fields, the same winters. And so the circle stretched onward, born in poverty, raised in labor, weed without choice, aged in hardship, and buried quietly without fame. The death of a peasant was rarely remembered beyond their family, but it was their collective, anonymous existence that kept entire societies alive. Strangely enough, amid this harsh cycle, peasants still found joy in the smallest of things. A harvest that filled the barns, a child who survived the winter, a cow that gave birth to a healthy calf. These humble blessings were cherished like treasures, for they were proof that even in a life filled with struggle, there was still reason to carry on, to turn the wheel one more time. If lords and nobles read books for knowledge, peasants read the natural world to survive. For them, the sky, the fields, the rivers, and the winds were open pages, and only those who learned to read them could endure. They looked up at the heavens. Dark clouds rolling in from the west foretold rain. A crimson sunset promised strong. Winds, flocks of birds flying low, signaled an approaching storm. They listened to the chorus of frogs and knew the rains were near. They inhaled the scent of damp earth on a summer breeze and knew seeds would sprout. This wisdom was not written in parchment or taught in schools. It was spoken by fathers to sons, by mothers to daughters, preserved in memory rather than ink. Every season bore its own signs. In spring, the first green shoots pushing through the frost were celebrated as if they were miracles. In summer, sleepless nights were spent watching the skies, praying the rains would not abandon the fields, guarding against thieves who lurked near the granaries. In autumn, when the fields turned gold, every stalk was cut and laid out to dry, with anxious eyes on the clouds, fearful of sudden rain. And in winter, each family counted their firewood and grain stores, measuring out the days of survival as though time itself was rationed. The 4 seasons were 4 battles fought year after year, merciless and unrelenting. Yet within that cruelty, peasants found beauty. They loved the wildflowers that lined the paths, the murmur of streams in spring, the fragrance of freshly cut grain in autumn, even the whistling wind through the trees, for it reminded them that they were still alive. Nature was their enemy, yet also their companion, punishing, nourishing, and teaching all at once. From this paradox grew a quiet love, stronger than any oath or vow. These lessons from the natural world became their true inheritance. No parchment bore record of it, but memory carved it deep. Children grew up learning to read the rain in the leaves, to find healing herbs by their scent, to tell the weather by the flight of crows, and they passed this knowledge on in turn, making it a hidden treasure that flowed like an underground spring, sustaining the village through countless generations. If castles and courts were the brain of society, peasants were its heart. That heartbeat steadily, unnoticed and unpraised, but if it ever stopped, all else would collapse. And it was only because peasants had learned to read nature, that the heart of society never ceased to beat, no matter how harsh the winter or how merciless the summer drought. If hunger and cold were constant enemies, disease was the sudden blade that struck without warning and without mercy. A small cut while harvesting hay could fester into infection, swelling and spreading through the body. A simple cough might turn into pneumonia, snatching away a life within days. Children seldom survived their early years. Many were buried before they could even speak. Adults wore down quickly, backs bent, teeth lost, hands trembling by their 30s. The elderly, if they reached their 40s or 50s, were rare treasures, living books of memory whom the whole village revered. Medicine was a distant dream for peasants. There were no royal physicians, no exotic remedies, only midwives, healers, and handfuls of herbs gathered from the forest. When sickness came, daisies were steeped into teas, willow bark chewed to lower fever, sage burned to drive out evil humours from the body. Sometimes these remedies worked, often they did not. Families would watch helplessly as a loved one wasted away, their only recourse to whisper prayers before a wooden cross on the table, hoping for a miracle that seldom arrived. Plagues were more terrifying still. Rumors of strange deaths in a neighboring village would spread panic like wildfire. People avoided one another, shunned touch, even a glance, yet death crept in all the same, through rivers, along roads, carried on the wind. When fever or pestilence descended, an entire village could sink into mourning within weeks. Wails filled the night. Bodies were buried hastily in shallow pits with no coffins, no rites. Survivors watched from a fearful distance, knowing even the breath of the dying might carry doom. And yet, peasants did not collapse beneath the weight of death. They learned to accept it as part of life itself. Tears were shed, but at dawn the fields still demanded work, for children still needed bread. Death did not paralyze them, it hardened them. The familiarity of loss became a kind of armor. In dim huts, beside flickering candles, mothers still hummed lullabies to feverish infants, though they knew the child might not wake. Fathers still sharpened plowshares, though their hands shook. From sickness, they did not wait for miracles. Their only hope was to endure one more day. And if morning came, that alone was victory. For the medieval peasant, the town was another world, both alluring and alien. On the rare occasions they could step into a market fair, it was as though they had wandered into a dream of colour and noise. The air was thick with unfamiliar scents, dried fish mingling with the tang of tanned leather, sharp spices wafting from the stalls of foreign traders, smoke from roasting meat drifting together with the sourness of ale. The soundscape, too, was overwhelming. Hawkers shouting, horses clattering over cobblestones, drunken laughter spilling from taverns, the quarrels of men in fine cloaks. Peasants moved timidly through the crowd, their eyes wide with awe. They saw shimmering fabrics, gleaming knives, supple leather shoes, luxuries far beyond their reach. In their purses rattled only a few copper coins, or they carried sacks of grain to barter for salt, a handful of iron, or, if fortune smiled, a new blade. The fine goods were for gazing at, not for owning. What truly mattered was salt to preserve, meat for winter, or nails to mend the plough. Yet simply witnessing the bustle was enough to widen their world. From the mouths of merchants they heard stories of distant lands, of vast seas, of cities where lights burned all night, of castles where feasts never ended. They knew they would never see such places, but the telling alone was enough to spark dreams. Back in their huts, these tales became treasures retold around the fire, fueling children's wonder and elders' nodding recollection. The town became a fleeting dream, but one powerful enough to sustain them through another year of toil. At the same time, the stark gap between classes revealed itself most clearly in the town. While peasants wore rough wool and mud-stained feet, the wealthy paraded in dyed cloaks, fine shoes, and jingling purses. Their mocking glances and derisive laughter reminded the peasants of their station. Yet the peasants carried a quiet knowledge. No city could survive without their grain, no castle without their wool. This unspoken truth was a hidden comfort, though no lord would ever acknowledge it. When they left the town, their burdens were small: a sack of salt, some dried fish, a knife. But they carried home something greater: stories. In the long dark of winter, those stories were retold again and again, warming hearts like firelight, helping them forget the wind howling at the door. The market was a brief dream, but it was enough to keep hope alive. The traces of medieval peasants were not carved into stone monuments or written in chronicles, but pressed into the very soil they worked. They left no grand statues to endure, yet every footpath from village to field was worn by their steps. The low stone walls stacked along field edges, the winding ditches channeling water from streams, all were built stone by stone, spade by spade, evidence of their labor. If you looked upon a fertile field, you would forget that it had once been forest or wasteland littered with rocks. It was the peasants who cleared the trees, hauled the stones, and turned it into a place where seeds could take root. A peasant might live his whole life without leaving a name, yet his presence lingered in the straight furrows of the earth. When he died, his son continued. When the son died, the grandson carried on. The land itself became their inheritance, not written in documents but etched in sweat and scars. It was an unspoken contract with nature. The earth offered survival, and in return they gave their toil, their blood, even their bones. Within the village, few thought about immortality, yet in their own way they achieved it. Not immortality of fame, but of marks left behind. The road they cleared remained. The well they dug still gave water. The cowshed they built continued to shelter animals. In this way, their lives became embedded in timber, in stone, in furrowed earth. Centuries later, archaeologists might uncover a shard of pottery, a rusted plough blade, a fragment of charred wood. These fragments, dismissed in their own time, became the only evidence of entire generations. From them, scholars attempted to reconstruct history. Yet peasants themselves never imagined they were leaving history at all. To them, each day was only about surviving winter, about reaping the next harvest. But by living those simple days, they had written their story into the land itself, indelible, though nameless. If castles symbolized power, then fields symbolized endurance, and within every handful of soil lay the memory of unseen hands, the silent but essential souls who sustained the world. When summer arrived, though the fields demanded hard labor, at least there was no terror of frost, and in the warm evenings, peasants sometimes found rare moments of peace. After long days of harvesting or weeding, they would sit outside their huts, watching fireflies flicker above the grass, listening to crickets sing, their weariness softened by the quiet of the night. Children lay on heaps of straw, eyes wide as they gazed at the star-strewn sky, ears tuned to the stories their parents told. These tales were not chronicles of kings, but folk legends, of knights on horseback slaying dragons, of princesses trapped in towers, of monsters lurking in dark forests, of saints who saved the poor. The adults knew such stories were make-believe, yet they told them with enthusiasm, for they too needed a touch of wonder to escape reality. In those moments, peasants could imagine themselves as more than bent-backed labourers. They could be heroes, if only in the eyes of their children. Music often accompanied these summer nights. Someone would bring out a reed flute, another would beat a rhythm on a wooden drum, and soon the village would sing together, simple songs with clumsy dances around a fire. Laughter echoed into the darkness, drowning out the insects, even the wind. These fleeting joys became memories to last a lifetime. In old age, people remembered their first summer dance, the thrill of a first touch of the hand, the haunting sweetness of a flute that seemed to echo forever. Such moments of peace were more precious than gold. They did not erase poverty or injustice, but they reminded peasants that they were alive, not merely surviving. This was the one luxury that no lord could seize, the memory of summer nights where fireflies, songs and fairy tales wove together and turned peasants into dreamers in a world that forbade them to dream. Of all the hardships medieval peasants endured, injustice was perhaps the most persistent and visible. It appeared in every meal, every harvest, every tax. They toiled from dawn to dusk, sweat dripping into the earth, hands hardened into callus and scar, yet when harvest came, most of their grain was heaped onto carts bound for the Lord's granaries or the church's storehouses. What remained for their families was just enough, sometimes not enough, to scrape through the winter. And if taxes were missed, punishment was swift, whips across the back, livestock seized, or worse, eviction from the very land they had bled to cultivate. Peasants were not ignorant. They saw the gulf plainly. They saw castles glowing with candlelight while their own huts sat in darkness. They heard music and feasting while their children cried with hunger, but they held their tongues, not because they lacked anger, but because they knew anger led only to death. Every peasant revolt in history was drowned in blood, each one a lesson carved into memory. The plough could not defeat the sword. Instead of rebellion, they chose endurance. They swallowed their bitterness in sighs, turned their resentment into whispered jests after supper, or mockery disguised as folk plays during festivals. These were their safety valves, their quiet protests, small sparks of resistance hidden under layers of obedience. Endurance was not cowardice, it was survival strategy. For they understood that to live, one must sometimes bow the head. To bow was not to surrender completely, but to preserve enough strength to pass on to the next generation. The paradox was that patience made them stronger than any throne. Castles could crumble, dynasties collapse, kings fall, yet fields always greened again, and peasants always returned to the furrows. Unnamed in chronicles, they nonetheless outlived every ruler. Their immortality was not of glory, but of persistence, of planting seeds in spite of injustice, of enduring long after the banners of kings had rotted in the ground. The children who grew up in medieval villages carried within them a quiet courage they never named. From the start, they knew hunger, they knew blistered hands, they knew the sight of parents trudging to the fields before dawn. Their childhood held no carved wooden toys or fine cloth dolls like those in towns, only stones, sticks, and the wise companionship of a thin, loyal dog. Yet out of scarcity they learned inventiveness, turning scraps into play, shaping joy from almost nothing. By adolescence, innocence gave way to duty. Boys followed their fathers to the fields, learning to guide the plough, reap the grain, mend fences. Girls followed their mothers, spinning thread, patching clothes, tending younger siblings. Their lessons came not from books but from earth and fire. Do not let seed rot in the barn. Never leave firewood uncut before winter. trust not the first rains. These sayings, simple yet stern, became etched into memory as rules of survival. Sometimes dreams still flickered. A boy might imagine himself a knight, a girl might yearn for the life of a city dweller. Tales told by the fire stoked these flames for a moment. But soon reality smothered them. Dreams were burdens when bellies growled and hands gripped hoes. The young learned to seek happiness in smaller things. A wooden spoon carved carefully by a father, a calf born in the night, a loaf of bread browned and crackling from the hearth. These became treasures of youth. Survival itself was cause for joy, making it through a winter less bitter than the last, enduring an illness that swept the village yet spared one's family, waking to see another sunrise. And when they grew into adults, few complained of fate. From childhood, they had been trained to accept that they too would be peasants, bound to the endless cycle of sowing and reaping. Yet beneath resignation lay a hidden strength. The power of those who could live within poverty without letting despair devour them. They stood as proof that even under the harshest fate, humanity could still smile, still endure, still hope. When hair turned white and backs bent with age, medieval peasants had little wealth to pass on. They left no chests of coins, no acres of land, no castles or titles. What they handed down was memory, experience, and stories. In the dim glow of the hearth, the elders spoke to their children and grandchildren of years of hunger, of droughts, when bark was ground into bread, of years of plenty, when barns overflowed so quickly that new bins had to be built. These stories were more than recollections. They were lessons for survival. They taught the next generation how to keep seed grain dry, how to recognize herbs in the forest, how to read the winds before a storm, how to store firewood before the snows came. Each tale carried a fragment of knowledge, and together they formed a treasure, invisible to outsiders but invaluable to the village. This was the true inheritance, not gold but wisdom carved into memory. The elders, though frail in body, were anchors of the community. They settled disputes, preserved the village's history, offered guidance when younger folk faltered. When a child fell ill, a grandmother recalled the herb that might soothe it. When a youth sought to marry, a grandfather spoke of patience, of the balance needed to keep a family strong. Their authority was not of books or law, but of endurance, lessons purchased through decades of toil, sorrow, and survival. And when death drew near, they did not greet it as strangers might. Death was an old acquaintance, one who had visited countless times to take away siblings, children, friends. By the end, the elderly knew it would soon knock on their own door. They asked for no riches, no grand funeral, only to leave this world. Near the fire, surrounded by family, not alone in a frozen field. Their graves were simple, shallow mounds near the church or the fields they had tilled. No monuments marked them, yet in the hearts of their descendants, their voices remained, their lessons endured. And thus, though they left no tangible wealth, they passed on something far greater, the strength to endure, to plough again, to carry on the wheel of life. The world beyond the village was ever shifting. Dynasties rose and fell, kings were crowned and dethroned, wars flared and faded. Yet for the peasants, such upheavals were like distant thunder, loud but far away, with little to change the soil beneath their feet. In the village, life spun in the same relentless cycle, spring for sowing, summer for weeding, autumn for harvest, winter for survival. Whether the king triumphed or failed on the battlefield mattered little when inside a clay hut the only question was, will there be bread tomorrow? This repetition made peasant life feel like a prison of endless circles. But it was precisely this constancy that kept society from collapsing. If armies were the sword of the kingdom, peasants were its lifeblood. A king might boast of knights and castles, but without full granaries, no army could march, no court could feast. Real power, though unacknowledged, lay hidden in the grains of wheat held in a peasant's hand. Peasants understood that political change usually meant heavier burdens. A new king brought new taxes, but the plough still had to cut, and the earth still had to yield. And so they learned to live as though time stood still, as though the winds of history passed over their huts without notice. They did not expect deliverance from rulers. Their faith was in their own hands, their hoes and their stubborn strength. Paradoxically, this very stillness became the most enduring history. A castle could crumble, a noble house vanish, a dynasty fade, but the fields greened again year after year. And when chronicles celebrated kings and lords, what they truly rested upon were the invisible millions of peasants who sowed and harvested through every storm. Peasants did not seek praise or immortality. For them, victory was surviving another year, planting another field, raising children who might live longer than themselves. That quiet, persistent triumph was the foundation upon which all societies stood. Amidst the harshest poverty and endless toil, medieval peasants still found joy in the smallest of things, moments so modest that outsiders might dismiss them. Yet, to the peasants, they were reasons to keep living. A wildflower blooming along the field's edge could bring a smile to a weary woman's face. A newborn calf, trembling as it stood on unsteady legs, could spark more happiness than a bountiful harvest. A rainfall arriving at the right moment could save the crops, and the whole village might gather beneath eaves, laughing and cheering as though blessed by heaven itself. Such joys were fragile, but they kept despair at bay. During the long nights of winter, when wind howled around the huts and stomachs growled with hunger, families retold memories of better times. The year when grain overflowed, the festival where bread and ale were shared, the sickly child who had miraculously survived. These recollections, cherished like jewels, reminded them that not every season was cruel, that hope always had a chance to return. Happiness also came from solidarity. When one family finished their harvest, they lent hands to another. When a hut collapsed in a storm, the whole village rebuilt it. When a child was born, everyone came to celebrate, offering what little they had, a loaf of bread, a jug of milk. In scarcity, generosity became the only true luxury, and in giving they found strength. Through such gestures, peasants understood. They were not alone in their struggle. To nobles, these joys might have seemed trivial, unworthy of record, but for peasants they were the very foundation of survival. Without them, despair would have swallowed their world. It was because of a wildflower, a calf, a timely rain, that the wheel of life continued to turn. And from these scattered fragments of small happiness, the great tapestry of human history was woven not only from battles and kings, but from the quiet smiles of the nameless who endured. From afar, the life of a medieval peasant might seem nothing but grey, mud, straw huts, meagre meals, endless labour. Yet up close, that grey revealed countless hidden shades. There was the warm brown of fresh bread pulled from the oven, its scent filling a cramped hut. There was the soft green of fields after rain, sunlight glimmering on droplets clinging to the stalks. There was the rosy flush of a child's cheeks, still smiling despite patched clothes. Within hardship, there lived a beauty quiet but undeniable. Peasants loved their families with a love unspoken. There were no flowery words, no costly gifts, only deeds. A father who rose before dawn to plough so his children might have a hot bowl of gruel. A mother who went hungry so her sick child could eat. A child who carried firewood to ease their parents' labor. This love was like a hidden stream in the forest, silent, unseen, yet nourishing everything around it. The strength of community, too, brought color to their grey existence. When disaster struck, no family was abandoned. Thin arms lifted collapsed beams, neighbors shared their last handfuls of grain, firelight was passed from hearth to hearth. That bond made them stronger than any fortress wall. A castle might fall to siege engines, but the unity of peasants could not be broken. Peasants did not live to be remembered, but precisely for that reason, they became the unseen foundation of history. They were the hidden pillars beneath the structure of society. No statues were raised for them, yet it was their bread that fed nobles, soldiers, merchants, and priests alike. If they had ever ceased to sow, all kingdoms would have starved. Their power, though silent, was absolute. In the dim huts of night, peasants still smiled, not because life was easy, but because they had learned to find light in darkness, to see colors in the grey. And it was they, the nameless millions, who were the true soul of their age. Through winters of biting frost, summers of drought, waves of pestilence, and the fires of war, medieval peasants endured. They did not endure as radiant heroes celebrated in song, but as silhouettes of quiet resilience. They left behind no poems, no statues, no chronicles, but it was they who kept life itself from being extinguished. Imagine a single day in their lives, dawn breaking over misty fields, a man guiding a rusted plough into stubborn soil, a woman coaxing fire from damp sticks, children running barefoot across wet earth. Day after day, such scenes repeated, without triumphs or glories, only endless labor and waiting. And yet it was, these days, their monotony, their persistence, that built history. For if history is a grand castle, every stone of it was laid with peasant sweat and tears. If victories were written with soldiers' blood, the bread that sustained those soldiers came from peasants' hands. Kings might dream great dreams, but without the peasants' toil, those dreams would collapse into nothing. Peasants were nameless, souls. They passed into the earth quietly, buried in the very fields they once tilled. Yet the earth remembered. It held their footprints, their sweat, their harvests. The land itself became an unwritten book, recording a story the chronicles forgot, not only of misery, but of endurance. They never waited for miracles, for the only miracle was survival itself. To live another day, to raise another child, to witness spring return after the long dark of winter. Each sunrise over the fields, glinting on bent backs and weary shoulders, was proof that despite oppression, despite forgetfulness, despite contempt, peasants were the bedrock of the world. When we close this story, we may forget the names of kings, lords, and generals, but we cannot forget the image of a peasant bent to the earth, hand clutching seed, eyes lifted to the sky. They were the nameless many, yet without them no history would ever have been written.